Nothing contained in this videocast is intended to encourage the use of illegal substances. This videocast represents only the opinions of the host and their guests and should not be taken as medical or legal advice. In no way does listening, reading, corresponding, or interacting on social media with our content establish a doctor-patient or legal relationship. The content here is intended to share thoughts and opinions and foster constructive discussion. Please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions concerning cannabis. The views expressed by hosts and guests on this videocast are not necessarily the views of Global Cannabis Times or any other company with which the hosts and guests are associated.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Going Global, a Global Cannabis Times videocast that seeks to act as the eyes and ears on the ground in emerging cannabis industries, both internationally and here in the U.S. And of course, one of the most exciting emerging markets today is New York's adult use market, where we saw just in the last 2 weeks the first retail licenses issued and the first version of the adult use regulations issued by the state. So we have two great experts here to help us get familiar with what's in those regulations and talk about some of the implications down the road. I'll have them introduce themselves in a minute. I'm Tom Adams. I'm the CEO of Global Go Analytics. We're the data and analytics arm of Global Go, the consulting firm. And I will ask then our two guests today, John Purow and Ryan Fingerhut, to introduce themselves.
Great to meet you all. I'm Ryan Fingerhut. I'm the Director of Client Services for Global Go. Global Go is an international cannabis business consultancy. We've done over 250 licenses in over a dozen states, as well as operated in many countries, but done licensing in 3. We're very, very well situated both in New York and in just generally expanding into global markets, where our main interest is helping our clients to move into the new jurisdictions in this exciting field. John?
Well, thank you, Ryan. So my name is John Purow. I am a counsel out of the New York office of Zuber, Lawler. I think the law firm is what we would call OGs in the cannabis space. They've actually been in cannabis for 16 years, dating back to the early days of California. And we have cannabis attorneys across the country in many different states and basically help in every state. And we help our clients in the cannabis industry with virtually any of their needs. My particular focus is on brands, trademarks, IP, and regulatory work with a focus on New York and New Jersey. And one of the other hats I wear is for Global Cannabis Times. I host a podcast called Cannabis Last Week, which includes recaps of everything in the industry and interviews with some luminaries in the field. And one other thing to mention on this is we also, through Global Cannabis Times, throw networking events in person in the area, the tri-state area, called 420 Connect. And then we also have virtual networking events we're going to try and do, I think, hopefully monthly going forward, called Coastal Connect, connecting experienced operators from mostly West Coast states, Midwest states, with people in the New York, New Jersey area towards New Jersey and New York license opportunities and very kind of structured networking. So, Tom, thank you for having me.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, you make a good point. And that's kind of one of the things I wanted to dig into, is comparing what's happened in other states to what's now looks like it's going to happen in New York, given our first glance at the regulations that were just recently issued. So 2 things struck me as I was reading through the cheat sheets the two of you are working up to help your clients understand what's in the regulations at this point. One, New York seems to have studied the prior states in great detail. And has gone to great lengths to set up very elaborate rules to avoid what it clearly views as mistakes made elsewhere. I don't want to get into that, whether you think that's going to work or not. And then they're taking a very focused approach to social equity and labor-friendly approaches to legalizing adult use cannabis in New York. So I think the net result is an elaborate set of rules, as I said. Designed clearly, it seems to block market concentration amongst the big guys, if you will. And that's, of course, of interest because the big guys, the MSOs, have the majority of the current medical market, and I think kind of assumed that they were going to slide into a pretty dominant position in the adult use market, and a lot's been done to kind of prevent that from happening. So I wanted to flesh out a lot of that. What that means, of course, is that that's probably makes it a pretty good land of opportunity for a lot of other companies. So with that kind of overview in mind, And the fact that, by the way, New York has the third largest concentration of, or number, I should say, of millions of cannabis users in the world. Therefore, there's quite a bit of potential in this market. So let's start with that. There was a lot of talk early on that the medical licensees would be allowed to essentially buy their way into a situation in the adult use market. $20 million was kicked around, I think, at one point, as the fee to be able to just get going. And that's been changed, has it not, John?
Yeah. So that's, so look, the MSOs, multi-state operators, and when I use that term, I'm referring to, the 10 to 12 biggest companies, in the country. Most of, I think at this point, since the 18 sale to Riv Capital, which is a part of Scott's Miracle-Gro, not typically considered one of the MSOs, but after that sale, basically all of the vertical medical license holders in New York are owned by larger entities. And look, they came in over the past couple of years, they followed the model that they did in other limited license states like New Jersey, get a medical vertical, lobby, get adult use passed, and hope to have first mover initiatives or other built-in advantages. And New York didn't play out the way that they necessarily intended because of these things that you said in terms of the focus on, social equity and helping out the little guy and helping out residents. What was happening with the state when you referenced the $20 million was, New York, you also talked about how New York is learning from other models. Well, the biggest thing that they did in terms of putting their finger on the scale, the regulators, in doing something that no other state had done, was this idea with conditional retail program that they're trying to, hand over the first dispensaries that'll be opening in New York to people who have been impacted by the war on drugs. And the aspect that they've thrown in is there's going to be this big fund, and it's going to, basically help give these loans to open the doors and book properties that the state is going to help find for all of these people who win these licenses. And they needed the money for that. And so where do they look for that money? For that kind of crossover fee from the medical to the adult use. And they were asking for 20 million a pop, and they were getting a lot of pushback. And now in these proposed regulations, and I want to note that these are proposed, we are in a 60-day comment period. I think we fully expect that the regulators have, as we saw in some of the conditional programs, amended things that we should expect changes, which will then, subject to another public comment. And so we're not looking at applications probably being open until, after Q1 2023. So these medical license holders now, it's 5 million to cross over, but their hands are tied in certain respects. They're not going to be allowed to open up adult use sales for 3 years from the first date that their sales in the legal launched adult use market. And so they're allowed to wholesale and do other activities, but that's not there for them. I think to a certain extent hasn't played out the way that some of these, large companies intended. And even in the past couple of months, we saw some of the biggest companies back out of deals in New York because of the uncertainty. Now, it's before the regulations dropped, but they got a little bit scared off by the fact that it did not seem like the terrain was really in their favor. So that's just another thing I wanted to mention.
Yeah, and when you say sales, you're talking about retail sales, right? They have other things they can do, but just having retail stores is
yes, the adult use sales,
right,
are they have to wait.
Right. Got it. Okay, Brian.
I was just going to add, I think that a lot of the MSOs that got involved in the medical side have been a little bit surprised. I think most of us have been surprised by this round of regulations as well as the law, with just how prominently antitrust has factored into what they're doing and the prohibitions they're putting into place. I would almost start thinking of New York more as a European market than an American market, because they really do seem focused on putting barriers to monopoly and oligopoly, or basically too much centralization of power, so that certain figures can start to price fix, start to limit. One of the more interesting things is they put a regulation into place where wholesalers must sell product to people who have cash to purchase that product. So you can't say, oh, this strain is only going to be for certain types of dispensaries or something like that, and create certain types of what at least the state regulator is seeing as anti-competitive business practices.
Interesting. So there'll really be no chance to kind of have exclusive products at retail.
Not if that exclusivity goes to a certain dispensary.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, going along with what Ryan said, I mean, how these large focuses are built in, the true parties of interest, right? The financial regulations, the type of documents that they're going to be looking at, they are, by comparison to other states, very, very specific, give the regulators a lot of power, to try and sniff out who's behind the scenes really, and try to make it very specific that, they don't want certain people owning interest in different parts of the chain. I think that there's this kind of separation between the people who touch the consumers in some fashion, on-site consumption, retail, dispensaries, delivery. And then there's like the separation in ownership between cultivators, processors, distributors, people upstream. And we should note in these proposed regs, 2 license types are not included right now: delivery and on-site consumption. On-site consumption, I'm very curious about because it's new to the overall industry and could be a great thing to fight stigmas. And delivery, while there's stuff built into the retail, because retail can deliver, delivery is extremely important when you're talking about a place like New York that has such an entrenched illicit market that is all based in delivery. And one thing I'll just add on that is, with this emphasis on seeing who's behind the scenes and preventing certain things, the unintended consequence may be that they've bound people's hands too tight in terms of raising funds. I mean, so Ryan, in terms of retail dispensaries, looking at interests, I'll cue this up for you in terms of, one thing that jumped out at you in the proposed regs as to true parties of interest and what they can or can't own with respect to retail. You flagged something that'd be really problematic.
So for every other license type out there, there's a ban against owning certain types of licenses within the state of New York. Exclusively to retail in the current proposed regulations, there's a ban on owning certain types of businesses in any other jurisdiction, meaning that if you cultivate or manufacture cannabis under a license in any other state, you are precluded from owning a retail establishment in the state of New York. That's pretty major. That basically shuts out almost anybody who, is a major player already, because most of the major players, or at least in some version, vertical, and at least one jurisdiction. And so this pretty much precludes them from owning in the state of New York a retail license. That's a pretty major factor. The fact that it was isolated like that, one would imagine that it's an intentional and not some type of oversight on their part. Although the paragraph does read exactly the same, other than those last few words in the retail paragraph. So we'll have to see, but I agree with John. That is probably going a bit too far. It's one thing to force somebody to choose what side of the vertical they want to be on. It's another thing to say that because you did this somewhere else, you are now precluded from ever doing it in our state.
And honestly, it clicked in my head when when we were talking about that, Ryan pointed out, is I think that there are parties that have won conditional retail licenses that are probably in violation of that already, which is,
But it seems like the MSOs would be too, right? They certainly have licenses in other states, or does that feed them?
They're in a separate category.
They're going to they're going to pay their way in despite that. Okay.
Yeah. Right. To be clear, just because you said MSOs that are already in through a medical license.
Would
be an exception to that rule. Right. But MSOs that are entering for the first time very much fall under it.
Yeah. Interesting. So the current medical licensees that are multi-state operators do get kind of an advantage there. At least they're big, well-capitalized competitors that have not entered New York before this would be precluded by this rule from entering. So that's an interesting wrinkle. Yeah. This whole TPI concept, is it, there's been some regulation of multi-license ownership, of course, in almost every state, practically, well, except for those that kind of required it, like Florida, right? So, Ryan, maybe you can give us a little bit of a view of that. How does this shape up on that front, from the huge range from vertical integration required to vertical integration completely banned? We're kind of at the extreme end of this, aren't we?
And I look, the two states that you just named, Florida and New York, are frankly polar opposites.
Yeah.
Probably not just in their political bend, but also in how they're approaching this. Florida wants large operators. They're the ones who require forced vertical integration to an extreme. New York wants the exact opposite, where Florida wants a few parties, less, but less than 30, that are control, and knowing exactly who's responsible if something happens. New York instead wants to make sure that the environment is not controlled by a few very well-heeled parties. They see social equity not just as social equity from a racial justice impact perspective, but also from a many small businesses rather than just a few large ones. I once was in a social equity conversation, and somebody pointed out you can do whatever you want with social equity. At the end of the day, capitalism is capitalism, and having more resources in the fight usually means you're the winner. And so New York is basically going out of its way to try to force a scenario where people with the really deep pockets simply don't have access, or those deep pockets don't really benefit them that much because scale is severely limited all across the vertical.
Yeah. And it's fascinating that you mentioned the political dichotomy between the two states. On the other hand, you have less of a dichotomy between, say, Florida and Oklahoma, but one, a completely free market approach, Oklahoma, which is achieving, you got to think, I would suggest, a lot of the goals that New York has. Very diverse ownership. It's nobody's controlling the Oklahoma market at this point, right? And then another, reddish, purplish state, at least in Florida's case, going with a very regimented and strict set of vertical integration rules. So one of the great justice, and I forget who it is, John, maybe you recall, is it Brandeis, that called the states the laboratories of democracy.
Sounds about right.
We're definitely.
Ryan's also a lawyer, so if he knows.
I hate to put you on the spot. That was law school was a long time ago, I know. So it was one of those supremes. But in any case, I've noticed that's been the theme of the cannabis industry since I've gotten involved. Is that we're really going to see, different experiments tried, and New York is another one of those.
I do want to point out one thing, though, that was changed in the regulations that I actually think is very good the other way. True parties of interest now specifically excludes people called financiers. These are people who get involved in lending to cannabis companies and have no other way. They don't have any type of control type position, any type of future interest. They get their money back through normal interest type payments rather than profit sharing or anything like that. If you keep yourself to sort of, basically, if you're effectively acting like a financial institution would, they're going to keep you outside of TPI. That was a major issue that a lot of people saw, was that, the availability of lending money was going to be very sparse in the state of New York, because anybody who lent into one company would then be precluded from lending into almost any other types of companies because they would automatically become a TPI. This change will hopefully free up a lot of capital to be invested into these small businesses. So I do want to definitely call that out as a positive change.
Interesting.
And that's an example of them showing, right? You know what? I forgot. Whenever I go out and I talk, I always do like the disclaimer up front, like the regulators, they have the toughest job in the world. I would never want it. They're juggling all these competing interests. Their, intentions are always pure and good. But obviously laws, unintended consequences, regulations have unintended consequences. And as I said, I gave an example of where the regulators did something that no one else had done with the conditional retail on the properties. But, right, what Ryan just, pointed to was they realized that there was an issue there. They realized that some of the stuff was too tight and they were constraining capital too much, which is so needed to launch these businesses, and they changed. So that's why I think that, some of the issues that we're flagging now, hopefully by the time that there are final regulations, they're not an issue anymore. So they have shown the ability to learn from, or to listen. And I think that that's really, really good. And they're not just letting politics, purely guide policy.
Yeah. Yeah. It's actually, I just want to clarify that, Ryan, in this exception for financiers, we're talking about debt financing, right? So equity ownership, or even minority stakes will still be subject to the TPI rules, but
there's an exception for passive investment, which I
okay.
believe is under 5% with no
Oh,
control.
okay.
So you can own a very small bit of equity, but this is more, one of the big issues, which I know we're going to get into a little bit later, the 10, what was it? The 10, 50, 100 rule.
10, 50, 100 rule. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, the 10, 50, 100 rule. The that's gonna put a lot of people automatically into the TPI category for any major pieces of money. So any type of exception, frankly, to the TPI rule is very, very important to focus on when it comes to funding. At least if you've got, investors who are not willing to go through that level of disclosure, which frankly, most debt financiers are not. So
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and jump into that. That's one of the major wrinkles here, because there's a whole set of risk sharing and service agreement regulations that kind of apply across all the categories. And we'll get into the categories, by the way. I'm kind of trying to deal with the big picture issues first, and then we'll get into each of the license types. But service agreements, of course, are everywhere in this industry. Typically around getting around, working rational deals to deal with required vertical integration, like in Arizona, where the theoretically they just licensed the stores and everybody was going to do the entire supply chain, but there's all sorts of side deals where people are doing work for each other. Here it's not obviously to get to work around vertical integration requirements, but there is these a bunch of terms around risk sharing, service agreements, and this 10, 50, 100 rule. Can I ask whoever's memory is working best at this point, what specifically is that 10, 50, 100 rule?
Sure. So the 10, 50, 100 rule is that you automatically become a true party of interest, subject to all the disclosure requirements, subject to all the vertical, your participation in different parts of the vertical will all become subject if you either get 10% of the net profit, 50% of the gross profit, or $100,000 within a single year from any single licensee. And they will take multiple charges and put them into the aggregate. So you can't get around this by, say, charging, $10,000 for this and $30,000 for that and $40,000 for this. They want to track it back. And if they find the same individuals behind it all, and we'll probably have to get into, and I haven't seen anything in the regs on how they would deal with, say, individuals who own very small pieces of multiple companies. But anyway, the idea is they want to get away from sort of, Tom, what you described. Now, in a vertical model, that sort of makes sense, where, I really only wanted to be a retailer, I really only wanted to be a cultivator, and I've got all of these other functions that I need to perform. So I'm going to find somebody who wants to perform them and bring them in. And there's a lot of businesses, white labeling is a very legitimate model that is being used all throughout the industry. Where I think sometimes the regulators get a bit irritated is when these service agreements and profit sharing agreements and whatnot become so drastic as to the person who's really making all the fundamental decisions is not the person who's considered the owner of the license. It's actually one of these management agreement people who's basically wearing the license like a glove. That's where they're really trying to get away from that. And this is frankly one of the most severe I've ever seen, this 10, 50, 100. It's ultimate, and it will definitely catch, I think, every single one of these type of people. But I do think that it's going to make legitimate white labeling and a lot of those types of services probably very difficult in this area, just because when you talk about, $100,000 in the cannabis industry is just not that much money.
Right.
And the cannabis industry is famous for having very large grosses and not so spectacular nets. So 10% of a net might not necessarily be that much, though 50% of the gross is probably pretty healthy.
Yeah. Yeah. But on the other hand, 50% of the gross, meaning that, for example, would a white label partner who's really producing everything for you might be treated as a TPI.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, if they're, you see some of these licensing agreements, they purchase the cannabis, they purchase all the input products and just give it to them. They do all the salesmanship, they provide the distribution. Once it gets to a certain extreme, I think that's what the regulator is trying to get at here. Like I said, this is a fairly restrictive one. So they might be going a little bit overboard, but that's really what they're trying to get at is management service providers who are really the licensee in all but name.
Right. Yeah. Although let's come back to this when we get to the distribution license, because it also would seemingly affect the asset light approach to getting your brand into New York. And there are some other rules around that broke well for brands, but this may be a problem. So let's come back to that. One last thing kind of on the overall questions before we get into those individual license types. What's a R.O.D and what's a R.O.N.D? It's everywhere in your cheat sheets and I drew a blank.
Sure. So it's an acronym. I don't remember what it's
registered organization with dispensing, I believe, and registered organization non-dispensing. Those are the vertical medical license holders that we were discussing earlier. And it's R.O.D is they can have their dispensaries, and R.O.N.D is they don't. Certainly, I guess not at the time that they came up with the acronym.
Okay, gotcha. All right, so that may come up in the discussion later, I thought, and so let's get that defined. Okay, gotcha. So basically, the existing medical licensees, of one type or another. Okay, cool. All right, well, let's get into again, some of the license types are generally reflective of what we see in other states, right? I think one of which is the microbusiness, right? Which we've seen in California and many other states. If you could distinguish it from what we've seen elsewhere, or are they basically the same? Is it just basically a smaller operation that's allowed to operate in more stages of the supply chain because they're agreeing to basically keep their operation small? Is that basically
look, it's not necessarily the similar as all of them, right? Because right next, door in New Jersey, microbusiness, they had to go for a specific type of license, right? That's what they applied for. So here is you effectively, as you said, you have this vertical capability, but it's like keeping you in your own little contained unit where you're growing a certain amount and processing your own product, and then you could sell it. And I think if you can, I think sell all of your own product in your own store, then you're allowed to sell it to other places. But it's not that you could use your processing to take on other locations. And reading between the lines, it really seemed like the only instance in which a micro business would be getting, pardon my voice cracking, puberty at 40, it's rough. And really, I think the only instance that seemed to be built in there is, say a micro business had a catastrophic, issue with its grow, then they could, bring in biomass from somewhere else and process that. But otherwise, it's not like they're going to be able to contract out their processing capability. It's really kind of intended to be this self-contained unit for the most part. And so, that's, this goes along with those ideas of trying to favor the little guy versus the big guys. And so creating these craft, the equivalent of a craft brewery in the, I think Illinois, right, was one of the states that helped pioneer this. That's what they're looking to do here. So
in New Jersey, just to clarify, when you said a single license, you had to apply for microbusiness cultivation, microbusiness retail separately, and you're limited to one. And I guess it was basically just a way to another option where you had to accept some limits on how big you could get.
Yeah, they had arbitrary limits, some of them that made less sense for a certain type versus 10 employees and everything. And the idea was, I think, to make it easier for people to get in, and then you could apply for a full license after operating as a micro business for a time. The New York model really is, there are limits built into it, but you are vertical. And some of the things that they built in are interesting in terms of how close things have to be geographically. Like the retail store has to be in the
right.
same, I think, county as where their other operations are, because it kind of seems like they didn't want the idea of driving all the way across state for your micro business. They want it to be all relatively close by to each other.
Yeah, so to John's point, micro businesses exist in many different states. Generally speaking, the one uniformity is that they're somehow reduced they have some type of prohibition on their scale beyond other types of licensees, and they usually have certain type of cost factor breaks or things like that. For instance, retail licenses here don't have to unionize. They're excluded from that requirement. However, personally, when I look at New York's, I think of it a lot more similar to California's, just because, to John's point, it's vertically integrated. A lot of them aren't. It's got requirements, all around limitations on how much canopy you can have versus, the regular licenses, limitations on how much you can produce. You can only have one dispensary location. It has to be within, on site and or within 25 miles of your grow. So, and one of the interesting things though about California's micro businesses were actually specifically created for people in Los Angeles who already had these integrated businesses and were going to have to sell their businesses off because of the way it is. I actually suspect strongly, just from having read these are actually targeted similarly, but at the rural locations where the legacy people are probably growing and selling to the immediate area, at least from some of the legacy farmers cultivators I've talked to. That's kind of how their operation's working. So I suspect it's the same thing. It's a way of getting the legacy operators in without them having to torch their current infrastructure.
Okay. Yeah. So, and there's some rules, different rules about the TPI limitations too for micro businesses, right? There is the possibility to be involved in other licenses, is there not?
Yeah, there is some ability for crossover there. With respect, I think micro businesses is relation to like we talked about the separation. So the micro businesses can't a TPI, or micro business can't be a TPI, or landlord, financier, goods or service provider to the dispensary, delivery, on-site consumption, and lab. But for the upstream items like licenses like cultivator, processor, distributor, co-op, they can. As I said, that's really where you see this differentiation line across the different license types.
And generally, the micro businesses are fairly dramatically smaller. We're talking about an outdoor grow square footage limit of 10,000 square feet versus 100,000, I think, in the for the full license. So we were talking pretty micro for the most part.
Yeah, but I've talked to people, potential clients who said, with the caps of where they are in terms of the number of pounds and everything, we could have a nice business there if we succeed. So there definitely is a fairly large amount of interest in that license category I've seen.
Yeah, because it's worth noting, without jumping too far ahead into the licensing, but the definition of canopy that we're talking about here, that's only vegetative and flowering plants. When they talk about these square footage caps, they're not talking about the facility. They're not talking about cloning or tissue propagation. They're not talking about processing area or drying rooms. So, you can actually, get a pretty decent crop out of some of these square footages because you're only talking about producing plants. And especially if you're talking about an environment where you're flipping over plants pretty quickly, you could see it won't be, the massive grows that you hear about out of California or Nevada, but it will be a substantial go, especially when you consider it compared to what's currently going on in the legacy market.
Yeah, and one little cap tied to that is that says that they're not supposed to process more than 1,700 pounds per year unless more biomass was grown by the micro business. So there's no, there's no real cap, right? They have the facility that they're tied into the size, but as Ryan said, you could produce a lot. So just I guess the last note on micro business.
Yeah, no, interesting. So that a lot of people I've known in California kind of complain about the limits they've got, as to what they can do here, but it sounds like there'll be a little bit more freedom in New York for the micro businesses. While we're talking about those kinds of limits, let's jump to the grow license side of things, where as I understand it, there will be these firm caps on how big a grow you can have in the entire state. And those caps are essentially well below what some of the MSO entrants have been talking about. A lot of them announced projects in 2021. For example, PharmaCann, 180,000 square foot operation in Hamptonburg, with plans to expand that by 75,000 square feet. GTI talking about a $50 million facility in Warwick, and Cresco with a 360,000 square feet in Ulster County. So these are just kind of by the boards at this point, are they not? The limits will not allow that, or am I missing something?
Sorry, I'm looking up the exact tiers here for outdoor.
Yeah, sure. Take a minute. That's because this is kind of a key question for the.
I mean, I was looking at them. I think that they're over. I think it's without other approval. Though I don't know if the R.O.D or R.O.N., now that I think about it, were specifically carved out from those caps is the only other thing that would occur to me there.
Yeah. Okay. Could be. Maybe that's what you're getting for your fee, is the ability to go beyond this. Because why would with a kind of a labor emphasis, yes, that's where the labor emphasis and the anti trust emphasis may come into conflict, is that labor in some of these towns would benefit from a huge facility, but the antitrust impetus urges against it, right? So
yeah.
But did you find those numbers, Ryan?
Yeah. So the maximum size is 100,000 square feet. Tier 5 being 50,000 to 100,000 square feet. So anything over that in any one category is going to be now it's interesting, and there are some mixed requirements here because you can have both an indoor and outdoor square footage, and they look at that separately. As a good, for instance, you can have up to 100,000 square feet, and then you can also have 30,000 square feet up to 30,000 square feet of mixed light. But you're definitely gonna have to look at it. There's a couple other things that were interesting about the way that New York was looking at this. The first is that there is a strong emphasis, the strongest I've ever seen, on environmental factors. To the point where you're going to have to do an annual report on your cultivation, and especially for indoor, they want to know everything having to do with your power outage versus your yield, how much water you're using, what's happening with your runoff. These factors are going to go into both, but they're a major factor when it comes to this. And I want to emphasize that, especially if people are looking to do a very large indoor grow, which, given New York's weather, is where a lot of people are looking. The fact is, another major thing that was very unique about New York, they have the right to push you down a tier when they do your license renewal. If you aren't selling, if you aren't selling at least 50% of the cannabis you grown in the previous 6 months, that's major. That's major. Now, that's not an obligation on their part. It's a may. So as a good, for instance, I don't suspect they're going to do that in the first year when people are still struggling to get retail out. You're going to have a really good excuse, frankly, for why you didn't do that and why you might be sitting on inventory. But especially as time goes on, I very much suspect that they're going to, when it comes time to, especially if they have, say, like a flourishing black market or something where cannabis is going out the back door, they're going to be looking at that. And frankly, the ones they're going to be looking at first are going to be the indoor grows for the environmental factors, because it's just not as environmentally efficient. There's nothing you can say, or do to make indoor cannabis as environmentally efficient as outdoor. Now, many people will say it's a much superior product, the indoor product, but from an environmental standpoint, it's also much costlier to produce. So I would very much be looking at those factors, especially because I think that they're going to weigh heavily on your application, what sort of factors you have to make you a more environmentally friendly cultivator.
Yeah, and it sounds like, we've seen this kind of effectively happen in Colorado, for example, the world's largest outdoor cannabis farm, Los Sueños, that operated there for years. It still does. It's been sold, of course, but all going into extraction and therefore into edibles and vapes. And whereas all of the flower was being grown indoors. So, and of course the weather in Colorado probably about as equal to New York in terms of appropriateness for the outdoor grow. But that's an interesting wrinkle, is that you can have both. So a single major player, for example, could be growing all of their flower to be sold as flower indoors, whereas generating its raw materials for manufactured products outside. That's interesting.
One thing I want to note about
Yeah.
cultivation, I mean, we've known it since the bill has passed, but I think it's very important, is that cultivators can do limited processing of their own grow. Where that line draws is an interesting question we're going to see in this first program as it gets up and going. Certainly flower. And speaking of outdoor grows, the fact that they, remove the microbial, testing for this first outdoor grow from the conditional cultivation program already tells you a little bit about sometimes the issues in terms of growing outdoors in New York. But they can also apply for a processing license to process their own goods, and they could apply for a distribution license to distribute their own goods. So that is built into cultivation, that you could have that, essentially that entire upstream section under one license holder.
Okay. And one last question on the cultivation side. And actually this applies to all of them now that I think about it. Are there limits on the number of licenses that will be issued in any of these categories at this point?
No.
Yeah,
So
go
you
ahead.
mean the number of licenses that they're going to issue in each category?
Yeah.
No, right now, the only one that has been artificially limited is the card, the retail,
Right.
conditional retail, which was limited to 150. It is strongly suspected by everybody, including myself, that there will be artificial limitations on this.
Okay.
The regulations don't create any artificial limitation or obligate them to, but they allow them to. And what I highly suspect, and I think most of the professionals in this area would suspect, is that what will happen is you'll get tranches of a few hundred at a time each year, so that they can manage the rollout here. Definitely, I think you hit the nail on the head, Tom. They've been paying attention to what other regulators have done. And in other states, we've seen it go bad both ways, where they limited to way too few. For instance, Ohio, where they had to almost double the number within the first 3 years because they so underestimated demand, versus states like Oregon, where they had a huge glut of overproduction, and that pushed a lot of people either to making some pretty hard choices between the illegal market and bankruptcy. So anyway, I think the regulators here are very cognizant of that, and I think they are going to move forward, but they haven't artificially limited themselves either way, which I think is smart.
Yeah, indeed. So that's a critical issue in cultivation. Of course, the crisis that Oregon's gone through, really every state that's got too much cultivation has had a rough time, of course. Seems to be compounded by this idea that that they can push you down a tier if you don't sell everything, right? Such that and I guess you're right, they may hold off in the first year because it is a may, not a must, for the regulators to enforce this. But to the extent that they do, there's going to be a fire sale situation, for anybody who's facing that kind of downgrade of their license, right? So I guess the regulators still have some control, though, given that it's a may, not a must, as to how fast wholesale prices come down in New York. But again, without at this point known limits on how many cultivation licenses will be issued, it's a threat anyway at this point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on, though, because we have several other types to get to. The distribution licenses. I know before this set of rules came out, Ryan, you had brought up to me the issue of there being the threat that there would be no co-branding allowed on the packaging, right? One brand name per package. That seems to have been lifted now, right? So that would seem to open up the opportunity then for brands from outside the state to come in and do deals with license holders. And in effect, what has become this traditional asset light approach to getting your brand into new states. Does it look that's good to go for, say, the Wanas and the Kibas and the Wilds of the world that may not want to get licensed in New York, but will want their brands there?
Well, I mean, I could chime in here. Right now, the way that it's in the regs is that the people that are doing the branding are the processors, not the distributors. So some of the interesting things, that jumped out at Ryan and me are that we're very curious to see if they change when they, once they process people's comments. It says that distribution is one really, and it's a little bit contradictory, but where it is explicit, it really seems that the distributors, the sole license holders, the people who are just in distribution, they are really just ferrying completed product from the cultivators or processors, I guess theoretically microbusinesses, from the suppliers to the actual places that are putting in the hands of consumers. It is going to the retailers, on-site consumption, delivery. And so that's really interesting, because you would think that there could be some real, economies of scale, opportunity for distribution going from cultivators to processors. And that doesn't seem to be there right now. And so that's very, very interesting. And the other thing that's in there was that ties to this is distributors are only supposed to be taking product that is in its finished packaging, right? They can't slap a brand on. There's nothing built into the proposed regs that will let them do that. And so it's very, very limited. And the other thing I thought that was interesting in there in terms of distribution is there's even a mention to any specific margins that they're permitted, that regulators could theoretically, there's the expression, the maximum margins, right? That comply with fees that the regulators set, or maximum margins. So I think that there would be a hope that certain things are shifted in the distribution proposed regs to open up more of an opportunity here between ferrying between different parties that are upstream, maybe something in terms of some capacity for branding in some sense. But right now it is actually pretty limited in terms of a license type.
Interesting.
Yeah. And although to your point, Tom, just because I think there were two issues there, I think John did a really good job of talking about the distributor and the distributor's role. To your point, though, that was one of the major changes that happened in the licensing and packaging regulations from the initial iteration. Originally, black and white labels only, the prohibition against anything that sounded like candy or anything that sounded like something for kids was on everything on the package. And they required only one logo and only one brand name per package. That's been gotten rid of, the one brand name, one logo. You're now allowed to use color. So it's a little bit more mature. I mean, these frankly were very reductive, sort of medical only market type of prohibitions, and didn't really belong in an adult use market. And then, finally, wow, you're not allowed to do anything that really is attractive to children if the strain name itself has the word candy, or if the brand name, as established brand name itself has a name in it that might be considered attractive to children. As a good, for instance, Cookies, one of the most famous brands, has had people point out that kind of sounds like some, an edible that children like. But anyway, they're not going to go after you for that, for established things. They are going to go after you if you say anything that makes it sound like a candy, tastes like candy, or anything like that. But just saying the name itself won't. Like we said, you'll be able to have multiple brands. So you'll be able to a certain degree, white label and things of that nature. Though there are certain prohibitions in there. For instance, the fact that you can't white label with a processor, with what they call manufacturers in New York, unless you yourself are a licensee or you're willing to become a TPI of that processor manufacturer, which means that out-of-state people can, in fact, white label. People who don't have licenses can, in fact, white label with processors, but they're going to be limited in how many processors they can work with. And they won't be able to own retail because they'll become a TPI, basically.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting little prohibition that makes it trickier for out-of-state parties. You said like that to be more selective. Let's see if that sticks or not, because obviously there are a lot of very, very interested parties, clients included, that would like to have less regulation in that regard.
Yeah, but it's still the critical thing is, and it really was maybe a semantic thing. I didn't realize the good point you make, John, that it's the processors who are branding stuff, not the distributors. But that's the typical asset light model for somebody going into a new state is with one partner, right? They're not shopping it around and having 5 different people. In fact, the licensees in the state wouldn't stand for it, right? Why would they want to be, one of several cookies licensees in New York? And of course, the other critical thing there, Ryan, is that adults like cookies too. So
Yeah.
they really can't.
Cookie Monster, you gotta watch out for that guy.
But interesting. Well, that's going to be an interesting section of the market, of course, because New York is New York, and pretty much every brand in the country is going to want to be in New York. So, what other regulations appear to be on their way to adoption here, as regarding the processing side of the business, guys?
So I think it's worth noting that there are 3 different types of processing licenses. The first is a processing license, which really largely allows you to just label and package processed goods. This is the type of license that might be of interest to somebody who's frankly largely just going to be a white labeler. The second allows for you to both label and package goods, but also to infuse, creation of edibles, basically, beverages, sodas, things of that nature. The final one is a license that allows you to extract. Now, the extraction license allows you to do all of the activities below, so you can extract, create your edibles, infuse, as well as package and label, but it also allows you to extract, and it automatically allows you to extract with non-volatile solvents, mechanical means, CO2, ethanol. You will need further approvals if you want to extract with something volatile, such as butane. But there is a process to do that, though it's not necessarily guaranteed. The other thing worth noting, I think, with the processor licenses is that they are going to be limited about what's allowed to be in there. One of the major ones is they are limiting any synthetic terpenes. Only botanically derived terpenes will be allowed in any cannabis product. That's important for a lot of these types of cannabis companies that use flavored, vapes or things of that nature. For a vape cartridge, you're only going to be able to use terpenes that come from other plants. So as good, for instance, people will extract terpenes from oranges or lemons to create that citrusy flavor. That will be allowed, but you won't be able to create something that, say, synthetically makes something taste like a root beer or something of that nature.
Yeah, and up to 10%, I think, for vape products in terms of what those terpene ratio. And then, they have pretty broad broad list of the types of products that you can make. Jersey banned certain edibles and beverages off the beginning. Beverages are on the table under the New York proposed regs, and product potency is 10 milligrams per serving up to 100. For anything ingestible, 10 milligrams per serving up to 100 per package. So, for example, one thing is 100 milligram beverages in one container out. But for whatever reason, tinctures, they get treated differently, because I guess you could measure them out. They could have up to 1,000 milligrams of THC in a tincture. So I think that was just another little interesting note about processing.
Okay. And are there other limitations at the product level? Obviously germane to processors, but also the retailers, which we'll get to next, as to what can be sold in the stores. So sort of mega dosed beverages are out. Are there other just absolute bans on types of products that can be sold?
Well, retailers are only going to be able to sell cannabis products produced, of course, by a licensed cultivator or producer. They're going to be able to sell paraphernalia to be used for cannabis, and they're going to be able to sell branded merchandise, but only with their brand, not with other brands. So that's worth noting too. You're not going to be able to walk into a dispensary unless the dispensary is owned by Cookies. You're not going to find Cookies t-shirt in there. You're only going to find the branded merchandise for that specific store. Finally, they are going to be able to sell hemp products, but only if they get separately licensed as a retail hemp facility. So that's an option for them, but not necessarily a given, and won't happen automatically. For the most part, that's what they're going to be limited to. And then, of course, there are certain product limitators. As John said, all manufactured goods are subject to certain limitations on potency, You know, the flower doesn't have an artificial THC cap, but on the other hand, there's a tax associated with THC, both for flower and for manufactured goods. But manufactured goods also has the artificial emitter on there as well. But so the more potent your flower is, the more expensive it's going to be because of the tax. And you know, finally, it's not going to be the same sort of legacy market. I know a lot of people who are used to legacy markets, they can see samples, smell, touch them. There are going to be samples, but they're going to be behind little glass smell jars. You're not really going to be able to test them or pick the buds the way that some people in the legacy markets are used to. It's going to be all prepackaged materials. And that's largely, I think, the limitations you can expect when you walk in to a retail store.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And one thing to note, this is also built in from the law, but I think it's a point of interest, is you can own up to 3 retail licenses, and retail stores can deliver. So there are going to be people in, you know, different boroughs with different delivery radii. And that's, you know, that's something certainly, you know, very interesting to keep an eye on. But, you know, as we alluded way earlier, a lot more restrictions on who could invest in retail and own interest in other things or not, right? They really want people who are going to be exclusively focused on retail.
Yeah.
And just adding, because we've been talking about the vertical ban between being on the supply side and being on the retail side, but there's also a ban on being both a retailer and owning a consumption lounge. Consumption lounges, which John said, we don't have the regulations out for yet, but consumption lounges are sort of like a bar. You buy it there, you use it there, you're not allowed to take it home. Retailers operate more like a liquor store. You buy it there, usually in larger quantities, and then you take it home with you to enjoy elsewhere.
Yeah. On the other hand, the world's biggest cannabis market of today does not have much on-premises consumption, California, at this point. So, and very few other states allow it either. So it is implicit in these rules, even though the rules for consumption lounges have not been issued, that there will be consumption lounges in New York.
Well, to be fair, California is actually even more permissive than New York when it comes to consumption lounges. All retail licenses in California automatically come with a consumption lounge. The problem in California has always been the local governments banning it.
Okay.
So whether or not New York, now I do think New York will be a little bit more friendlier, just because at least in the 5 boroughs, we've seen a lot of chatter about how they realize they don't want people, you know, smoking on the streets. So giving them a place to you know, responsibly consume is a good idea. So I don't, at least in 5 boroughs, I don't think we'll see that. But I just want to point out, it's actually been the local governments and frankly, the tobacco laws against smoking indoors that have been the biggest impediment to consumption lounges in a lot of states that allow it.
Yeah. And a lot of municipalities, right? The really only thing that municipalities could opt out of were dispensaries and on-site consumption. And that was before the regulations were out. A number of municipalities did their trackers. Some will opt back in, certainly once they see, you know, the revenue that other places are making. But, you know, yeah, that's certainly, you know, one thing to kind of keep an eye on. And, you know, California, it's a huge issue in terms of what's like still a crazy high percentage of jurisdictions have opted out of dispensaries, and that causes issues. So let's see how that plays out in New York. And, you know, on-site consumption in the city is going to be very, very interesting to see.
Yeah, indeed. And in fact, I'm not sure what the rules are in Illinois, but of course, vapes have been wildly successful in Illinois because in a crowded metropolitan area, it's sort of the friendlier, more discreet way to consume, you know, through inhalation anyway. But are there rules around vapes in the current New York regs?
I mean, so in the processing, there are regulations relating to vapes, and it's just, I don't think there's anything too surprising in there. I mean, I think the botanically derived terpenes was very, very nice for a lot of experience, you know, vape makers. And I will say this, I mean, New York City, I mean, the decriminalization laws in the state and specifically in the city were very, very, very liberal because certain communities were horribly impacted by the war on drugs. And so I think that it already used to be that you could walk down a street in New York and you're going to smell someone smoking. Now it's way past that. And one thing I'll say about on-site consumption is there's actually even like a social equity angle, because people, if they get caught smoking a federally legal drug in certain subsidized housing, they could lose their house. So I know that came up in Jersey as a reason to, promote consumption and everything.
Lounges, huh? Right. Yeah.
Yeah. To John's point, there's a few specific testing regulations around vape, but for the most part, it's what you would expect from most other states, and no shockers to jump out.
Okay. All right. And let's deal with the retail issues then. I think the most significant one really is the limit on 3 stores, 8 for the existing medical players, but only after 3 years out, right? So does that mean we're headed for a California kind of situation where there's just not enough stores to support the size of market there could be? Does it, on the other hand, mean there'll be plenty of stores, but it'll just be a free-for-all with nobody really dominating the retail marketplace?
Honestly, it's hard for me. I don't know if John's got a better answer than this. For me, it's hard to tell, because I think what we see in places like California, frankly, have a lot more to do with the slowness and difficulty of opening your dispensary in those places, rather than, any type of artificial limitation. I mean, to John's point, there's a lot of cannabis deserts in a lot of these open states, California, Colorado, or whatnot, because of large areas where none of the local governments would allow for cannabis. So that's a factor. But I think especially in states like California, the real issue has been that it's taken people the better part of a year to open a dispensary, and holding on to real estate for the better part of a year in the LA market is enough to bankrupt anybody, even maybe not Bill Gates, but or Elon Musk, but anybody else. So I think that a lot of that type of determination will really have to deal with how efficient the regulator is in getting people licensed, so that these licenses, it's not just the fee, it's all the things that go into getting a license that really have to be understood by the regulator as the cost of the barrier to entry into this market. And so if the regulator really needs, for a large number of dispensaries to get in with a various group of owners, then they're going to have to make it easier for a various group of owners to open up a dispensary and affordable for them to do that.
And what other rules and regulations around the retail environment are going to prove important in figuring out where New York goes from here?
Well, I think one of the interesting things sort of to push for on the antitrust bend is that they are requiring all retailers to keep 40% of their shelf space open and available for non-medical converters. So not the R.O.N.Ds or the R.O.N.s, but also, R.O.N.Ds, but also the, any of the new market guys are going to have a chance to get on a regulator's shelf. I think that's pretty important. Also, the fact that they're allowing the retailers to initially start off with the delivery. So first, the conditional retail applicants are going to be able to do retail deliveries while they're getting their stores open in the first place. That's going to greatly accelerate when the retail market opens in New York, even if on a pretty limited basis, since I think only 28 people are licensed so far under that program. And then then the other retailers are going to be able to have delivery using up to 25 employees a month. So over the course of a month, up to 25 employees can be used to deliver. I think that's a bit of a limitation on scale there.
But is it a bad limitation? Because that seems like a lot of employees if you want to exclusively devote them to delivery. I think it seems like that's something where we're trying to compete with the illicit market. They have to cap it at something. 25 seems like a decent amount of employees.
Yeah, no, I mean, I generally agree with you there, John. I think it really becomes an impediment if you're planning to basically have a delivery only business, where you're planning to do a ton of delivery. That's where it's really going to become a factor. The other very interesting thing, New York is the only state I have ever seen that does not require a motor vehicle to deliver. That's probably a nod to how difficult that would be in the 5 boroughs, and especially Manhattan. But I know for a lot of us, it is definitely an issue. Of course, that's how the legacy market is operating there right now. So it's obviously doable. But that's definitely a factor that a lot of people are looking into. The other thing is everything that goes out, you can use online delivery, though it can't be from a third party website. I think they're trying to get away from, companies like Ease or whatnot that basically try to create a retail model without actually being a retailer themselves by stringing retailers together. So you are allowed to use online ordering, you are allowed to deliver, you are allowed to have curbside pickup, a window with special permission. So they're really gonna try to make this as easy as possible, but they are also limiting it a bit on scale. You're gonna have to, of course, pick it up in person with an ID. You can't just have it dropped off somewhere for obvious reasons. We'll see, how quickly this goes. But the other big thing is because of that ban on anything in the vehicle being not already having been ordered, that's going to get rid of the potential for mobile dispensaries, which I know is something that a lot of people are thinking of and wanting to do, but that's not going to be possible. You're going to be tied to a single geographic location.
Just to tack on to some of the things that Ryan said, look, we still need to see what the full delivery license is, right? Those aren't in there. There could be something very different in terms of how many employees they could have, but these are a preview of what to expect on those. I'm going to say that as a proud Staten Islander, born and raised there, one of the most interesting parts in the regs is when they're talking about the means of transport they carved out by boat, i.e. the Staten Island ferry. I think that there's a Staten Island ferry exception there.
Nice.
So there are going to be delivery folks sitting on the Staten Island ferry with a ton of weed in their, in their backpack. And I thought that was kind of entertaining.
Yeah.
That was the only other thing I wanted to mention in terms of.
And it's kind of, given the 3-store limit, the 25 employee limit seems impactful too. You could really cover a lot of territory out of 3 stores if you spaced them properly, and had sort of an unlimited number of delivery folks that could be driving or ferrying or subwaying or bicycling the product out to the customers. Are there other limits though? Is there any limit on delivery, or can you deliver from a dispensary anywhere in the state to anywhere else in the state? Theoretically, anyway.
Theoretically, if you can make it make business sense, you can. Also, there's a ban on local municipalities stopping you from delivering into their municipality. They can stop you from being physically located there. They can't stop you from delivering to a customer. However, one limitation on delivery is that it has to happen during your hours of operation, which the state says you can operate anywhere from 8 a.m. to 2 a.m. Each day. But your local government can limit it, reasonably. And also those other local governments, while they can't ban delivery, they can say, again, within reasonable limitations, not say you can't deliver at 2 a.m. They can say something like that. But they can't stop you from delivering at, say, 10 a.m., assuming that that's considered reasonable. So
those are incredible hours compared to most states too, aren't they? 8 to 2. That's the
city that never sleeps.
Exactly. And depending on the sativa to indica ratio, may do a little more sleeping now, but probably not much. All right, great. Well, that's I think covers each of the subcategories and some of the macro stuff. What about the process of getting licensed, applying, meeting all the requirements? It looks like there were some regulations put in there for discussion anyway, that there'll be, proof of land, building, and equipment required. And that's been problematic in some other states where a significant portion of the investment has to happen before you've gotten a license. Are applicants facing that kind of challenge here too?
Yeah, probably. So you are going to be required to show right to occupy the premises. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have the name in your the title in your name right now. It doesn't mean you have to have the lease where you're possessing it right now. It does mean you have to at least have some type of ownership contract or lease that is conditional upon you getting a license, you will in fact get right to the property. So you're going to basically be it to a certain extent. You're going to have to deal with a landlord. You're going to have to make a deal and hope you find one that meets all the requirements from a land use local position, and then is willing to enter into you with some type of contract. That's extremely important. If you look just south in New Jersey with their last medical round, which was in 2019, it took them over 2 years to decide who the winners were. Many of those winners were not able to take possession of their licenses because they couldn't afford to pay rents, even at some type of truncated level, which I'm hoping that they got during that period where they couldn't use their license. Many of these guys went bankrupt, or they just gave up the lease and weren't able to get it back in place, even though New Jersey gave them about 30 days to do that. They just weren't able to do it in that period of time, and or the people who they found wanted much higher rents. Probably the largest cost to going after a cannabis license is the real estate. It's maintaining possession of the real estate, because even if you do a really great deal with somebody, you're still going to be paying probably tens of thousands of dollars to secure that property. So it's definitely a major factor. What's also interesting about the regulations, one, I addressed it earlier, but there's a very strong environmental bent here. They're asking a lot of questions around the environmental. Frankly, it's usually a bit pro forma what the environmental sections are in other states. New York's really looking at it aggressively, especially on the cultivation side. I would definitely focus on that. Another major factor, and pretty much everybody could tell you that social equity and community impact is going to be a major factor in New York. But one of the things that's a little bit different that you see in these regulations is they're not just looking at your promises towards the future, they're looking at previous treatment of employees. So if you own any other businesses, they want to know what ratio of your employees are, given healthcare, what ratio of your employees are paid above the minimum wage. They're going to probably judge you in your application, at least, how much your promises are worth based on your history of treatment of employees, not just what you're planning to do in the future. So I think that's definitely worth noting, because those are things that are unique to New York outside of the normal, security, quality assurance type of issues.
Okay. John, any last thoughts about things people should be aware of as they gear up to
No,
apply?
I think that Ryan made a lot of the points that I would make, but with a better goatee. But the only thing I'll comment on is let's talk about the timeline here, right? We have these conditional cultivators and processors. I think the estimates were that there was like $750 million or something worth of crop, or something very, very large, and nowhere to sell it. And so now, they've handed out this first batch of licenses. They're going to try and keep on doing, the conditional retail, I think, at a decent clip from month to month, right? But we're really looking at, in terms of the number of retail dispensaries in New York State, maybe, 30, then another, and we're talking about delivery they're going to start with, not even opening up the actual stores. They have these illicit market stores everywhere in the city, possibly in other parts of the state too. And it's going to take time to crack down on those, so they're not an issue, because they could just handicap all of this from the start, because they're selling things that I guess fell off the truck in California, known brands in all of these stores, whether or not they're, how exactly they got them. It's going to be this trickle of stores opening up. There's already this supply built in. People in this next round, they're going to be behind all of them. So you're going to have, I think someone I was, talking to said that maybe, they get open all of the conditional retail stores. I don't even think by the end of 2023 is realistic. I think it's going to fall into 2024 in terms of those opening. And then the rest are going to be behind that. Then 3 years down the road, you're going to have all the R.O.D, the R.O.N.s cross over. So I think it's going to be years before they're going to be anywhere near enough retail stores, certainly physical stores, to meet demand. I think there's going to be that's why there's going to be a lot of emphasis on delivery. I think so it's going to be a very, very interesting rollout just in terms of the pace.
Yeah, interesting. The illicit market's moving towards retail, the legal market's moving towards delivery, and they're going to meet in the middle of Fifth Avenue and duke it out, I guess, and we'll see what happens in New York. I guess the flip side of the state doing all this studying and figuring out how it wanted to proceed is that guys like you have been studying this for years now as well, and so there is help available for the applicants who want to try and figure out how to build a business in what's going to be one of the biggest cannabis markets in the world. To the extent it goes legal. Already is, and now we'll see how fast it goes legal. So anyway, thank you two gentlemen very much for sharing your knowledge with us and our audience here today, and thank the audience for joining us. Don't forget to go to globalcannabistimes.com to both subscribe to the publication and view this, send this a link to this to your friends and neighbors and business partners and others who may be interested, and we'll appreciate that. And stay tuned for more as the laws get nailed down in New York and elsewhere. We'll be reporting on it here. Thank
you, Tom.
Take
Thanks,
care.
guys. Bye.